This past week, as I mentioned, I was on vacation, and my wife and I went up to Algonquin Park to do some hiking. I've been to Algonquin Park in the summer many times, and we decided to do many of the same trails that we'd done before. So we knew what they should look like, but I'd never been there in the spring. Spring hiking is different than summer hiking, and one of the reasons it's different is there was actually still a lot of snow on the ground, so that was interesting, and it snowed heavily one day that we were hiking. But the major challenge was that the snow was melting, so water was flowing. And the water likes to go wherever there's a groove or a low patch, and that meant that it often went right through where the trail was. And we'd just be walking along, so we had poles. We'd be walking along, and there was just a river in front of us, and we could see on the bank opposite, there'd be one of those blue plastic things that they nailed to the tree. Okay, that's where the trail continues, but you got to go through the river first. And of course, the river didn't, sometimes people will put like logs across, but it's so early in the season, there wasn't a lot of that going on. So it was just like, well, what do we do? There's a river blocking, and you can't go around a river, so what do we do? And we learned, after a little while, to just take a deep breath and assume that there was a way across. And then we would see it. Root, rock, root, ice, I hope it holds, root, rock, oh, and we're on the other side. And we did that a lot. In today's story, Scripture story, the disciples are living in a period where it feels like their trail has washed away too. They had assumed that Jesus was going to use his Messiah power to change their world, hopefully to get rid of the Roman occupation and let Jews live in peace again. But when he was pinned to the cross, that dream came to a crushing end. Obviously, that wasn't what the Jesus movement was about. And for a while, 3 days, they thought it was all over, and then Jesus reappeared, resurrected. He'd predicted this would happen, but they didn't believe it. And now, here we are, a couple weeks after Easter, and we're hearing a scripture reading, and we're told that in John's gospel, this is the third time that Jesus has appeared to them, resurrected. But before he shows up on that shore, they don't know what they're supposed to do next. So they just go back to doing what they were doing before they met Jesus. They go back to fishing, because that's just what they did. Back to plan A. So they go out one night in the boat, a bunch of the fishermen who are disciples, and they start fishing. But often fishing, as anyone knows who's been fishing, fishing includes not catching fish, right? You can be out for hours and not catch a single thing, not a single bite. And that's what happened to these guys on that particular night. There was no fish to be had. And then they see this man standing on the shore. The gospel, it specifies how far away they were. It was only about 100 yards. They should have been able to recognize Jesus if he looked like Jesus. But he's chosen not to look exactly like Jesus. So this stranger calls out to them and says, try the other side of the boat. And they go, okay, why not? We got to explain to our wives somehow, why we didn't catch any fish tonight, so maybe we'll get lucky this last time. And they pull in this huge haul. And Peter's the first one who figures out that guy on the shore, even though he doesn't really look like Jesus of Nazareth, it's the resurrected Jesus. So he runs across the water and he sees Jesus. And it's a joyful reunion, but Peter and Jesus have some unfinished business. On the night of Jesus' arrest, Jesus had predicted that Peter would deny even knowing Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. You may notice Lawrence Park Community Church has a rooster on the top of its steeple, eh? We're people who know from doubt. Well, sure enough, Peter denied Jesus 3 times on the night of his arrest. Jesus was taken into court. Peter follows as far as the courtyard. But when one of the servant girls says, hey, you've got a Galilean accent. Are you with that Jesus guy? He says, no, I don't know that guy. I have no idea who you're talking about. He does it 3 times. So Jesus has every reason to be mad at Peter. And Peter doesn't make it better. He doesn't go to the cross to be with Jesus. All the guys just abandoned Jesus on the day of the crucifixion. So Peter, his real name is Simon, but Jesus said, I'm going to call you Peter. And that just sounds like a name switch to us. But Peter, in French, this is more obvious. The word Peter is Pierre. And Pierre means boulder, means a big rock. So Jesus says, I'm going to build the church on the foundation of you, Simon, who I'm now going to call Peter, because you're going to be the rock on which this church is built. But Peter's the guy who denied him 3 times. Jesus has every right to say, why didn't you stand up for me? Why did you deny me? Why weren't you there for me when I needed you? But Jesus doesn't do any of those things. Instead, he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter goes, well, yeah, obviously. Great, feed my sheep. But then Jesus says it again and again. And by the 3rd time, Peter's kind of annoyed. And he says, why are you talking to me like this? You know that I love you. But note the number, 3 times. So Peter denies Jesus 3 times, and Jesus requires that he affirm his love for Jesus 3 times. This is Jesus' way of saying, okay, now we're even. Now I know that you've reaffirmed the faith. Just like we read the creed. You have to reaffirm your faith from time to time. And then what does Jesus say next? He says, feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. And I think one of the ways to approach this Bible passage is to see it as a little lesson in succession and leadership planning. Succession in the sense that, Peter, you're now in charge, but do you believe in the things I believe in? Do you love me? Are you good with our mission statement, to put it in corporate speak? And Peter says, yeah, of course I am. And then Jesus says, good. If you're good with our mission statement, because you love me and everything that I stand up for, feed my sheep. He doesn't say, feed yourself. He says, feed my sheep. So this is a model of leadership, which is about, if you're a leader, you're supposed to help the people who are part of the movement, rather than just helping yourself. Now, there are lots of politicians all over the world who get elected saying, I am going to rescue the working class and the middle class. I am going to help you. I will be your shepherd. I will feed you. I will get the state off your back. But then in practice, something else happens. Authoritarian leadership is taking over all over the world. Russia, China, Poland up until recently, Hungary still, and unfortunately, most recently, in our southern neighbor, the United States. And it used to be obvious that people who were elected to public office would be public servants. We had an election here on Monday, where on Monday night, when it became clear that the Liberals had won the election, Mark Carney stood up and pledged that he would be the leader not just for the people who voted for him, but for all Canadians. And that's not a radical thing to say. That's what being a public servant is. You unify the country after a divisive election, and you say, I am going to serve you. But that's not the way authoritarian governments think. Instead, they're interested in determining who's a real citizen and who's a fake citizen. Instead of feeding all the sheep, they decide which sheep are real and which sheep are fake. And we're watching this play out in slow motion in the United States as Mr. Trump declares that some people are real Americans and other people are not. And he's even trying to change the rules. He's trying to change how birthright citizenship works. For over a couple of centuries, if you were born in the United States, you were automatically an American citizen. But Trump is trying to change that rule so that if you have foreign-born parents and you're born in the United States, you're not really an American and we can deport you. This is not good. when a country decides that it can decide who is a real citizen and who isn't, and start narrowing the definition of citizenship, it's not about the identity of the people that they rob citizenship from. That's not the real issue. The real issue is that the government is saying, we want the power to decide who stays and who goes. This is about an accretion of power towards the government. And it'll say it's all about the Venezuelan gangs. It's not about them at all. It's about trying to establish a precedent so the government can have more power than it had before. And if you need proof that this is going on, just check out what's been happening in terms of what academics in the United States are doing. The leading fascism scholars in the United States are moving to Toronto because they know how this goes next. They saw how it worked in Germany in the 1930s, and now they're saying that's happening right now in our country in the United States, so we're going to move to Toronto. So Jason Stanley and others have moved to Toronto to take up positions at the Musk Center, the Munk Center, and U of T, because they realize they and their families will not be safe in the United States, talking about fascism as fascism takes over the United States. When Jesus speaks to Peter and says, "Feed my sheep," he's evincing a model of leadership which recognizes clearly that true leadership is about helping the people who are weaker than the leader. That's what it's about. That's what public service is about. Feed my sheep. But how do they do that practically? Like even back then. Well, Peter had been with Jesus for the whole movement. So part of feeding the sheep would be to tell the stories of Jesus. Because for this movement to keep on going, they were going to have to know what Jesus did, what Jesus taught, the sacrifices he made for people, the healings he did for people. So Peter was expected to tell the stories. So how did they do that? Well, there were no churches back then, and they weren't welcome in the synagogues most of the time, because most of the Jews didn't think Jesus was the Messiah. So they met in houses. They meet in houses in the morning before work or at night after work. And what they did was they would have potluck dinners. These things were called agape meals or love feasts, where everybody brought food. Everybody brought food together, and they would sit around the dining room table in a house just like yours, sit in a house, and they would eat together, slaves and masters, rich and poor, male and female, and those who didn't identify as male and female, straight and not straight, because people weren't all straight back then either. Everybody would get together around a table and eat and share the stories of Jesus and sing hymns, make up new hymns. We know that they created new hymns back then. And this is the way the Jesus movement started. And eventually, when Christianity got legalized, they built churches, right? Those first basilicas. But they kept that potluck thing going. If you went to one of the giant basilicas that had ceilings way higher than these in Rome, people at the beginning of the service would come with chickens and vegetables and fruit and bread, and they'd bring it up to the front. And even though they weren't having a dinner party anymore, they would just serve communion, it was expected that that food would be shared with the people who needed it most, in the congregation and without. And part of their liturgy, they would say, please accept these gifts, and we will give them to people who are in prison, as well as people who are too sick to come to the service. From the very beginning, the idea of Christianity, as Peter heard it from Jesus, is feed my sheep. And they took it literally, with food, stories as well as food. And so, spin forward 2,000 years, and churches are still feeding sheep, feeding believers and non-believers alike. This is why churches all over the city and all over the country run food banks, and they run soup kitchens, particularly if they're in neighborhoods where there are poor people. Now, Lawrence Park is not one of those neighborhoods. The people living up and down these streets don't need food the way other neighborhoods do, so we participate in the Out of the Cold program. We go down to Blythewood Baptist, and thanks to the efforts of Cecilia and others, food comes in, which is being donated, and we also buy it from various stores and restaurants. We put together the food, and then it's taken downtown so people who are living on the streets can eat it. And if we have leftovers, that food goes to a youth shelter called Eva's Place, who we've also supported. And this congregation has helped African refugees with food and rice cookers, as well as baby clothes. Some of the young parents here have been giving baby stuff to the church so we can give it to African refugee mothers who are starting all over having been here. This is how we feed the sheep now. One of the people who really understood this ethic of feeding the sheep, of course, was Pope Francis. Pope Francis, who died 2 weeks ago, and this week the conclave is getting together to choose the next pope. And they know that Pope Francis changed the rules on what it was like to be a Catholic pope. When he first arrived in Rome, the papal apartments are beautiful and grand, and he said, no, I'm not going to stay in the papal apartment. It's too fancy. I want a room in the guest house. That way I'll be able to see more people. I like people. I want to see people. I don't want to be like a bird in a cage. So he lived in the guest house for his whole tenure. I was in Rome last summer on sabbatical, and one day I went down to St. Peter's Square where there's these curving colonnades, so imagine big columns curving around, culminating in the church. And underneath, people are playing and hanging out and so forth. But the guide that I was with that day said, before Pope Francis became pope, all of this area was just filled with homeless people. Homeless people would sleep here because, there was shelter, and there was garbage everywhere, and it wasn't nice. And when Pope Francis became pope, he said to the Vatican staff, he didn't say clear them out. He said, go talk to them. Bring them food and drink. Let's get a relationship going. So they did. So they started bringing food and water, got to know them, helped them get housing. They also decided to build a shelter just 40 meters away from the colonnade within the Vatican grounds for homeless people. And seeing that homeless people were suffering from all sorts of medical problems, Pope Francis said, you know what? They need help right where they are. So let's take the Vatican post office and let's turn it into a medical clinic for homeless people. So that's what they did. So the Pope understood feeding the sheep means feeding the sheep who are hungriest and who need the most help. And one of the things which he did, if you go to St. Peter's Square now, there's this lovely sculpture there. Here's a picture of it. It's quite big, so it's pretty much life-size. So each one of those people is life-size. And they're standing on a boat. And as you can see, if we go to the next picture, it's a little more obvious. These are all refugees and people who've lost their homes. There's Jews there. You can see an Orthodox Jew with the hat on there. Mary and Joseph are in there. There's people from all periods of history who have been pushed out of their homes. And they're all on a boat. And the boat points towards St. Peter's Basilica. And Pope Francis commissioned this from a Canadian artist, a man named Timothy Schmaltz, who works out of Kitchener. And it's interesting. It doesn't, as you can see in the background there, that's the colonnade. So that's where the homeless people used to sleep. And that was all built in the 1500s, in the Renaissance. And people said, this sculpture doesn't look anything like the glorious architecture of the rest of the square. It doesn't look like Renaissance art. And the artist said, yeah, it doesn't conform to the Renaissance art, but it sure conforms to the gospel. And Pope Francis liked it so much that he actually commissioned another piece of art just recently from this same artist. I hope in the coming days that the conclave of cardinals remembers Pope Francis's example and remembers simply what Jesus said to the very first pope, Peter, feed my sheep. That's what we're called to do. And feeding can be spiritual, and it can also be literal with food and clothing and providing homes. But Jesus' point is true leadership. If you take care of those who are most vulnerable, you're really taking care of everybody, and the whole boat will be lifted. And even when it seems like our path has been completely washed out, if you follow that dictum of love, you and we and everyone will find our way. Amen.